is Ismet is a change catalyst. And that's exactly where I'm going to stop and let Ismet introduce herself a little bit better, because she's been everywhere. I understand that you worked in the financial sector, been an entrepreneur also, and now you're working in the creative space, and that too in a more technical and a scientific manner. So how about you shed some light as to what you're doing, what you've been up to?
Sure. So let me start with where I began my career path. When I was 14 years old, I made the very important decision that there was nothing better in life than to be an accountant. Not many 14-year-olds say that, but I was one of those exceptions to the rule. And I did go on to become a chartered accountant, and I worked as an accountant and an auditor, no less, for many years in the UK. And then in the US, I moved into industry and worked as a financial analyst for some time. Having children changed everything, because having no familial support and a husband who was working, all the hours that he was awake, I was really a single parent and trying to raise two toddlers, and decided that I needed to take some time off from work in order to be able to do that. And during that time, two things happened. One, I realized that nothing in my academic career or in my life experiences had really prepared me for the challenge of raising adults in the world that we live in today. And that I was really struggling, because all of the methods that my own parents had used would not work in the context that I was in. There was very little support, very little reinforcement, and also the situations that I was facing were very different from the ones that I had grown up in. And the other thing that I realized was that I really did not miss being an accountant. And what I discovered was that while I missed having the opportunity to create something and to have an impact, I found that there were many more ways in which I could do that that did not involve accounting. So that seed was planted in my head. Let's go back to the first piece, which was that I was struggling as a parent. And the way that I went about resolving that problem was that I started to journal. And in my journal, I decided that I was going to make a list of all the problems that I faced every single day. And all the things that sapped the energy out of me, that really got our day started off on the wrong foot. And since my children were only a year apart, it was quite challenging to have someone in their terrible twos and their even more terrible threes to deal with every day. And once I made a list of these problems, they looked really daunting. And so I said, well, let's just start with one, right? What's the one thing that gets everything rolling in the wrong direction? And started working on that. And then I said, okay, I've obviously faced this before. So what have I tried? Made a list of everything I tried, and then said, clearly the answer is not on that list, because I'm still struggling with the problem. So let's make a list of everything I've not tried, and then take something off that list and put it to work and see if it worked. And this little switch in how I was thinking about the problem, how I was thinking about possible solutions, started to create some change. And what it did was, it didn't necessarily fix the problem, but it changed it into something else. And then eventually it changed it into a problem I could solve. And as a result, what started to happen was I became addicted to the methodology, for one thing. And the second thing was, all of a sudden, I became the parent that everyone was coming to for parenting advice. So I'll never forget, almost a year to the date from the time that I started doing this, I found myself at a dinner party surrounded by parents asking me how I got my kids to behave the way they did or to do the things they did. And I could tell them what I did, but I knew it wouldn't work for them because their context was different. And yet I couldn't tell them how to find their answers because I wasn't sure how it was working for me. But I was very curious about that until I met someone who was facilitating, and they were using the creative problem solving process. And it was like finding the method to my madness, right? I discovered that what I had been doing intuitively was something that was very close and very similar to creative problem solving. And that there was a methodology, there were tools, there were techniques that you could use. And I was so intrigued. So at the age of 40, I decided to go back to school, go and get a graduate degree in the study of creativity and change leadership. And ever since then, I have been working in the field of creativity and change. And I always, while I do also work with parents, a lot of my focus is in the education space, so trying to bring creativity into education. I also work in the corporate space, but in a very different way from most traditional creativity and innovation facilitators, because my work is with people and about people, not about necessarily process and bottom line. So it's really empowering the people in the organization to be the best that they can be, to be the best version of themselves. And then I have the faith that if they are that, the company will thrive. And there are few clients who see it my way, but the ones who do have become pretty loyal customers. And so I have a very small client list, but a very dedicated client list. And I really enjoy that work. And the other last piece of what I'm currently involved in is developing creative thinking and creative problem solving capability in scientists in the global South. So in Asia and in Africa, I'm part of helping to design the African Science Leadership Program, the ASEAN Science Leadership Program, where we work with scientists who are kind of in the middle of their careers, giving them the ability to use science to advance their nations. So that's everything that I do in as short a version as I could explain it.
It's, I think we're going to have to get on another call to understand this a little bit more as well, and understand what your practices are like. But with what you're doing in the corporate world, and then also with your experiences having been in the corporate world as well, and for working for so many years, and this is a question that we've been asking all of our guests, just based on your own personal experiences, have you seen any kind of patterns that differ between millennials that are in the workforce versus the Gen Zs that are in the workforce right now? Anything that stands out according to you?
I don't know if we can attribute the changes that I've seen necessarily to the Gen Z and millennial distinctions. But what I have seen in the workforce, because I was so closely involved with a lot of companies when I was working in finance, and then I'm closely involved with companies now that I work in change initiatives. What I find is that the current generation of the workforce are much more about the heart and values. So if we want to use levers to help motivate them to change, the things that help to create change in those environments are really value-driven or emotion-driven. And emotions are generally linked to values. So I'm going to bring it all down to values. They are not there necessarily just for the financial aspect. So it's not transactional. Their relationships with organizations are not transactional. And they also want the companies that they work for to aspire to a higher purpose than just profit. So they really are interested in creating impact that will make the world a better place, impact that will create social change, impact that will create, contribute to counteracting climate change, just something bigger than themselves. They want to be a part of something that contributes in some way to more than a bank account. And I'm finding even with my own children who are Gen Zers, that as they're entering the workforce, because now, of course, that 2 and 3-year-old are 22 and 23 years old, they are making choices not just based on what is the pay package or what is the status or what is the designation or where will I end up in this career. What they're thinking about are two things. One is, what is the difference I will make, and what will I learn? So that's another thing that I've started to notice a great deal more in the current generations that are going through entering the workforce, is that they are really interested in continuing their learning journey. So what they're looking for are professional development opportunities that a company might offer. They're looking for personal development opportunities that a company might offer. Is there some way in which this company will not just use me the way I am, but also stretch me and give me opportunities to try something new? So something that I might fail at to begin with because I'm not experienced in it, but will allow me and give me the time and space in order to be able to grow in that direction, and give me the resources that I need to grow in that direction. So that is something that I never saw, or I saw very rarely. I shouldn't be using the word never, but I saw very rarely when I was in my 20s and 30s looking for jobs. But I definitely see that a great deal. And I hear that in the conversations that are happening today around entering the workforce. And I almost feel as if the youngest generation entering the workforce is actually even more so than the one before. So, in terms of millennials versus Gen Zers, you can see almost that trajectory is getting further and further away from the traditionals. I must say, though, that the Gen Zers seem a little less idealistic and a tad bit more practical. So they seem to be holding companies accountable in terms of keeping the promises that they make. They're a little more diligent about making sure that happens, because I think that they've seen the millennials get burned and sometimes find that the idealistic pathways that they thought they were on weren't quite as authentic as they thought they might be. And so they're a little more diligent about that. They do their homework around the companies that they're going to work for, rather than assume that what they say is true. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. So just to add on to that, actually, do you feel that, and two questions are stemming out from what you just said. The first is, do you feel that the younger generation, or the generation which is entering the workforce, even feels more or feels the urge to emphasize the need for a work-life balance, and that this is something that they look for as well from the workforce, that their employers are responsible for ensuring that as well?
I absolutely do. In fact, it's funny that you should say that, because during the pandemic, my client, remember I told you my client list was very small, but during the pandemic, I really whittled that down to just one client. And that client, I can name them, they don't mind, is Cartier, right? The jewelry company. And the CEO of Cartier actually reached out to me just a year ago and said, would you be willing to offer some parenting workshops for my team? And I was a little surprised. I mean, all of the work that I'd done with them in the past was around leadership development and helping people use creative problem solving for bringing innovative ideas into the company and giving and inspiring others to be innovative in the company. So really nothing to do with parenting. Right? And I messaged her back and said, can you help me understand why you're asking for that? Because then I can design something accordingly. And she said, my team is comprised of people who are doing their very best to work from home. And I know that they're doing the best that they can professionally. But personally, they're really struggling because they have their kids at home. They're trying to parent during a pandemic, and they're trying to find a work-life balance when, the lines aren't so clearly drawn anymore. And I don't know how to help them. And I know that you work in that space as well. And perhaps you might be able to offer us something around that. And I thought that's such an interesting ask. I mean, I was already offering parenting workshops, open enrollment parenting workshops. So I said, sure, I can do that for you. And maybe we can design a couple of other workshops as well. So we designed one around finding the work-life balance. And it was called Finding Balance. And we designed one which was around surviving 2020, which was, basically surviving a pandemic with your sanity intact. And what we did was within a matter of a week, we actually did a live webinar, Mercedes and I, and we talked about why we were offering these courses and how creativity can help us in times of crisis and how creativity was connected to resilience. And she made an offer to her team, which happens to be 600 people, the entire organization, and said to them, you are not going to make time in your personal life to take these workshops. You are going to take time off from work to take these workshops. And if that's a problem with your managers, you come to me and let me know. I'll make sure that happens. If your partners, your life partners, whether or not they work for Cartier, want to take these workshops, I will pay for that as well. Right?
Wow.
So she really put her money where her mouth was. And she made this, and she said, and you can attend as many of the workshops as you want. And she and I had also negotiated that for following each workshop, we would also offer some coaching sessions for people to just drop in and have conversations in a smaller group setting if they wanted to. And Asad, I cannot tell you how oversubscribed these workshops were. We ended up doing 30 of them altogether. And we had over 300 people from the organization take not one, but possibly all 3 workshops in the series. Right? So we really had such a huge response. And there were people when we closed it off and said, okay, now no more workshops, people came back and said, we didn't get a chance to do it. We had people sneaking in from Cartier, France, to join the sessions because they'd heard from their colleagues in the US that they were getting this opportunity. And so we had people who would beg, and kind of sneak in under the radar to join the workshops. So the need is desperate. And this idea of finding work-life balance is about polarities. And polarities are so prevalent in our personal and professional lives. And nobody ever tells you how to navigate that. Right? How do you work with something like work and life, where both are very important, but prioritizing one to the exclusion of the other is extremely detrimental to your health and well-being and your status in life. So it was fascinating to see the response. And the Finding Balance workshop had the most signups. So definitely, speaking to your work-life balance question, yes. People are desperate
really to that point. Yeah. Wow. So my second question, which stemmed out from your observations of the younger generation entering the workforce and how they are choosing to do, are trying to work for organizations or work with organizations which are bigger than themselves, and that they are not, self-centered is the wrong word, but I feel like what you meant was that they're not really trying to affect their own personal lives, but they want to affect the greater good and bring change all around. Do you feel that this same generation, though, prefers to work alone and seek opportunities in which their impact is announceable or is measurable in some way? Or do you feel that they're perfectly all right with working with a collective, working with a group, and then keeping it hush-hush and actually letting the work speak for itself?
So I think this generation of social mediaites, right? Because that's where we hear about their accomplishments, is not so much looking for credit as it is looking for celebration. Right? They're sharing. I mean, I really, I know that a lot of people see the younger generation as being very self-obsessed, perhaps that's a strong word, or being very self-centered, again, a strong word. They are not. To me, it seems as if that their projection in the outside world of what they are doing and what they're accomplishing is about celebration, and it's about inspiring others to be like them, right? So if we assume positive intent and we assume that they're doing this for a good reason, then the good reason is really a valid reason that they want to celebrate that we accomplished something or I accomplished something, and then to create a community around that accomplishment. So perhaps inspiring and igniting that same initiative in other places. So so when you see the celebration, it may seem very solo, but they are not doing this alone. And I don't think that's the point of the posts and the various kind of stories that you see on Instagram. I think the point is that here is something that I'm doing. Would you like to be a part of my community? Because nobody really wants to be completely isolated, right? Even a raging introvert like myself, I really need others to provide some amplification for my message, to give me feedback, to help me grow, to feed me, to replenish my well of inspiration. And I'm super excited because I'm headed at the end of this week to my first in-person conference in 2 years. And I can't wait for that because I am dying for those conversations. And I must admit that I enjoyed the 2 years of isolation a little too much. There were days when my family would say, "Have you left the house this week?" Because I was really happy to have, just quiet downtime, work on my own on my laptop, and work by myself. But eventually I realized that the amount of impact I can have is so reduced when I'm one person trying to make a difference. And working as a collaborative is really a much more powerful way to create change, because it increases exponentially rather than linearly, right? When we work together. And I think that the younger generation is very aware of that, more aware of that even than perhaps we were when I was when I was their age and in the workforce. They're in terms of individual and team, definitely prioritize individual accomplishment rather than team accomplishment. But what I see now in this generation is that they will sometimes sacrifice their own personal agenda for the sake of the team's purpose. So this idea of being willing to work in a team or wanting to work solo, I think that they've really figured out how to do both well. So,
interesting. Yeah. That's a very interesting observation. Thank you for sharing that. And this is exactly what, actually, this is a good segue into the next set of questions, which is all around culture. And just so I get an understanding, have you worked in Pakistan, or were you mostly working outside of in the States and in the UK?
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I have worked all over the world. I think at one point I had, within a matter of 1 month, I had done projects on every continent except Australia. So I can say quite comfortably that I've worked everywhere, or in a lot of places. And I have worked with organizations in Pakistan in my capacity as a trainer for creative thinking and creative problem solving. I would come to Click every year, which was a creativity conference that was, I think it went for 5 years, and worked with people from different organizations in Pakistan, small, large, individual, entrepreneurial. I had a chance to get to understand a little bit about organizations in Pakistan. And of course, being a Pakistani myself, I understand a little bit of the cultural implications of working in Pakistan as well. So that's the extent of my experience there, though.
Okay, interesting, cool. So according to you, do you think that is, and based on, of course, your experiences by working in every geography virtually, is culture top-down?
culture, I think the mistake that is often made is that people make the assumption that culture is top down, or needs to be top down. And I would say the answer isn't an either or. The answer is a yes and, which means that yes, the initiative has to come from top down, the modeling has to come top down, but the tactics need to come bottom up. So the aspiration can be set top down, but I believe that the tactics should come bottom up. I think that the conversation around what that culture looks like and how it grows into what it needs to be, that needs to be a collective conversation that is had at every level of the organization. So in terms of determining the fact that culture matters, that message should absolutely be top down. And what I believe should come from the top is they should practice what they preach.
Right.
What that culture should contain and what it should look like should be a collective conversation. And what those cultural concepts translate, how they translate into everyday practices should be absolutely be a collective conversation. So the culture conversation should start top down, but then the culture initiative should be throughout an organization. I have seen this time and time again, that the culture conversation starts top down and then it's kind of directed and prescribed top down, and then the very top stops practicing it, practicing what they're preaching. And so the culture initiatives go nowhere. And culture is a beast. I mean, you can't, it's like trying to change the course of the Titanic, with the iceberg in sight. And it really is something that all hands on deck, everyone has to row in the same direction and has to be nourished and celebrated for rowing in that direction. And so you've got to imagine that this boat is not going to move in the right direction unless everybody is on board with it and moving in the same way. And in order to get that kind of buy-in, you really do have to work hard on culture. So,
right. And it's the leadership that needs to not just recognize it, but also act as custodians of it and then implement checkpoints throughout.
Absolutely. Yes. And you also have to realize that culture is not a stagnant thing. It's not one and done. You need to take care of culture all the time. It's like a baby that never grows beyond the age of 6 months, right? You have to constantly feed it and take out what's not working and freshen it up and check in with it and make sure that you're continuing to pay attention to it. So you can't just implement a culture and then a culture initiative and then let it go and presume your job here is done, check that box. Culture is something that has to be nurtured and fed and reseeded and refertilized. Almost, it's like planting crop and being able to reap the benefits of it every year. So yeah, culture is it's a living thing, but it can make or break organizations. Yeah, so
completely
you can't
agree with
ignore
that. Yeah. And do you think that, and this probably would apply more to Pakistan, I'm not as well versed with workplace cultures internationally, but do you feel that the concern for workplace culture to maintain a healthy culture also comes out from those that have the privilege to think about it, that those who are not necessarily working to make ends meet, or that they are not the sole breadwinners, they are more likely to be affected by culture versus those that, of course, are the sole breadwinners, are the ones that are willing to take the crap, for the lack of a better word, and keep that on the side. What's your thought on that?
I am answering this intuitively, and intuitively, I think you're right that the conversation around culture is something that we are privileged to be having if we're having it. But it shouldn't be that way. Right. I really wish it was different, but I completely agree. You see, the culture conversation is something when you are able to meet the basic hygiene factors of living, right? So you have enough resources to take care of your needs. You're not under the kind of stress that you imagine that you might be. It's like, planning to go to Hajj. You're not supposed to really invest in going to Hajj unless you can take care of your family and you have enough resources to be able to take care of some of your future needs. So it's exactly like that. You can't really take the time and the energy to talk about culture until those basic hygiene factors have been met. So yes, it is a conversation for the privileged, but those of us who are privileged enough to be able to have that conversation, I think it's very important that we do have it, because what we can start to create in terms of change in an organization is helpful for everybody who's a part of that organization, and the people in that organization who aren't at the point where they feel that they can enter that space can still benefit from the changes that you can start, and they can still contribute to the changes. They may not feel like they can initiate the changes because that's risky for them, but they can certainly join the force and be one of the people who gets behind you. So if you have the privilege of being able to start a conversation around culture, you should. I think it's imperative that one should do that, because it benefits not just you, but also those who don't have that privilege. So, yes.
And also, I feel like it has to be communicated in the languages that people would understand. It's just empathy, right? Going down to someone's level to actually explaining to them and trying to instill those values. Whatever is dictating the culture, we're trying to get that out there.
So that's an interesting little segue that I'm going to go into. So I've been working a great deal around corporate culture. And what I'm starting to realize is that words like empathy don't mean anything to 70% of the people in the world. And here's the reason why. I know that the Myers-Briggs type indicator, sorry, not index, the Myers-Briggs type indicator, MBTI, has been kind of trashed and said, this doesn't work and it's not statistically sound and a lot of things. But I've used it enough to know that there is some truth to the science behind it. And one of the things that they discovered was that 70% of the world's population has a preference for sensing, and 30% of the world's population has a preference for intuition. What that means is that 30% of the world's population is really comfortable with words like empathy, and you can imagine what that means, and you know what that translates into in terms of practice. You can see how it connects to other parts of your life and make all of those inferences. But the 70% of the world's population who have a preference for sensing don't know what the heck you mean by empathy. That's not a concrete enough concept for them. So we have to translate that into what it looks like and sounds like and feels like, and what behaviors would you observe, and what would you hear, and what would people be doing when we talk about something like empathy. So when we talk about values and cultural values for an organization, we have to be aware that those have to be translated into something that is far less abstract and much more concrete, which is where it starts to sound prescriptive, although it doesn't have to, because you can allow the audience to interpret what that looks like in practice. So just being very careful that when we start talking about culture, we talk about a lot of abstract, high-level things, which then we also have to do the work to translate it into something that everybody can see, not just the people who have a preference or the ability to think in abstract terms. So just my little segue. when you mention it.
And it makes absolute sense because it's just, if it's not being applied and if it's not trickling down, if it's not being disseminated, if people can't live it, there's no point in thinking about it as well, I guess.
Exactly, exactly. And every single change model that you might look at always has, knowledge and understanding and communicating what's required as part of that model framework. And this is the piece that people often get wrong in culture initiatives, that they don't necessarily take the time to make sure that everyone understands what they are meaning by the aspirational goals that they've set. So,
right. Yeah. So do you think universities could play a role in actually, either fostering or trying to work on workplace culture?
I don't think the responsibility belongs only in universities. I think it belongs in our entire education pipeline, K to gray, right? That's why I work in the education field, because I think that a lot of the issues that we're facing as a generation today are possible to address and to avoid in the future if we can only start to teach some basic life skills and some kind of meta thinking tools at a very young age. So starting from kindergarten all the way through university, I think we can start to provide resources and provide opportunities and for people to be able to think in creative ways, in different ways, to be able to think about their thinking, to be able to create the pathways that they want to walk on. So to be able to create the change that they want to see in their lives. We often feel like we are victims. We kind of become, because in schools, we are always told that there's only one right answer to everything. We believe that there's only one version of success. And with that mindset, which is inculcated in us at such a young age, we start to narrow ourselves down in terms of possibilities. And if we could stop that, if we could just stop doing that, then imagine this, that everybody who faces a brick wall realizes that the only way to the other side isn't to keep banging your head against that brick wall. You could walk around it, you could climb over it, you could dig under it. I mean, there are many options that you can consider, and they're all still successful. They can all still be termed success, or you might just do a U-turn and find a different path for yourself. So the thing is that when we start to instill that ability and start to require it throughout education, this ability to problem solve, this ability to generate multiple options, this ability to choose, make really good choices, right? Making informed choices and good decisions, then we really are starting that conversation around creating a culture of people who are never stymied by dead ends and roadblocks, who are constantly taking initiative, who are leaders, even if they're leader of one. They act like leaders in their workplaces. So I think the work shouldn't begin at university level. I think that work needs to begin all the way from the age of 5 onwards. So, and parents, can contribute to that as well. So that's my piece around that.
Great. And last question on culture. 3 things you love about Pakistani workplace culture, 3 things you hate about it.
3 things I love about Pakistani work culture. Well, that's a great question. All right. First thing I love about Pakistani work culture is that Pakistani work culture very often is about relationships before transactional task-related stuff. So relationship is really valued in a Pakistani work culture, and people would really invest time and energy in establishing those relationships and building trust. So I think that that is something that is pretty, not necessarily unique, but pretty important about the Pakistani work culture. The other thing about the Pakistani work culture is that once you're in a place that you find is a good fit, you can plan on being there for a long time because it becomes tightly bonded. So, you become like family, and then the idea of going somewhere else becomes very alien and uncomfortable. And so once you find the right fit, you could be there for life. That's the second thing. The third thing is that, you can always, and perhaps this is related to the first, but you can always pick up the phone and ask for a favor, right? It doesn't always have to be transactional. This belief that if I reach out to someone for help today and they help me, and even if they don't, at a future point, that person can reach out to me and I would drop everything and help them. So this idea of not necessarily stopping to think about whether it's practical for me to help you, or I would bend over backwards to be helpful. And perhaps it's related to the first, but I noticed that about Pakistani organizations a great deal. So those are three things I think I really like about the Pakistani workforce. The three things I don't necessarily like is, one is that I think that the onus of strategic thinking seems to rest only with the highest levels of the organization. And it seems as if the rest of the organization just has to be tactical. They are not tasked with asking the question, what, who, where, why. Why is absolutely not their purview. They are not involved in the goal setting. They're not involved in the how will we get to the goal. They're just involved in how do we implement the strategies that have been given to us. And what that does is it really creates a culture of the worker bees and the queen bee, almost, in a hive. And that it doesn't take advantage of all of the potential that people bring to the table, right? Imagine that all of your strategic thinking is being trusted with a very tiny group of people, whereas the capacity for strategic thinking, which exists throughout your organization, you're not tapping into. And that's such a wasted resource. So that's one aspect of Pakistani culture that I would love to change. The second is about communication, transparent communication. We have, because relationships matter so much to us, we have a very hard time being transparent and honest. And I hate to use the word honesty because the opposite side is dishonesty, but perhaps it's being diplomatic or considerate. We tend to err a little bit on the side of going overboard and trying to maintain good relationships to the point where we perhaps are not helping people grow or improve or get the feedback that they need, and we don't make our expectations very clear. So that lack of transparency in communication is definitely something that we should try and get around. And the third, risk-taking. Right? We are very risk averse. As in Pakistani work culture, we are very, very risk averse. And this might be because if you think about the context within which Pakistani organizations work, life in Pakistan is very ambiguous. It's very uncertain, can be very volatile. I mean, you think about politically, socially, right now, with regards to health and wellness. So because life that we live, the context within which we live and operate is so volatile and so uncertain, and that perhaps that's why in the workforce, there's a lot of need for control. And people bring that mindset. from their everyday lives into the workplace. And so people are very risk averse. And when you aren't willing to take risks, then that means that you're never, forget getting out of your comfort zone. Your comfort zone is actually shrinking rather than even stretching. So there is little opportunity for growth, and there's little opportunity for try something new, get it wrong perhaps, but learn from it. So there's no room for learning in Pakistani organizations as a result. We only do what we already know we know how to do. And that can be very limiting, because that means that we're limited by what we know now, and we stop growing. And remember, the Gen Zers, and they want to grow, right? But they can't grow in an organization that's risk averse, because they'll be penalized for making mistakes. And you can't learn without making mistakes, because if you're not making mistakes, you're not really trying something new, and you're not really stretching yourself, and you're not really taking a risk and a step to expand your comfort zone. So that's my third thing.
Interesting. So this gets me to ask, do you feel that this could be these 3 points that you've just raised about what you dislike about the culture here? Do you think that, and what we've spoken about so far up until this point, do you feel that mentorship is a solution for these pain points or for these troubles or the downside?
Yes, if done right. I'm always fearful of prescribing mentorship that is top down. And when there is a huge difference in the workplace that perhaps the mentor grew up in and the workplace that the mentee is working in, right? Then perhaps the mentorship can be detrimental rather than incremental and beneficial. What I would suggest is that choose your mentors wisely, because mentors who are facilitative rather than directive will make all the difference. It doesn't mean that you can't have the elders mentoring the youngers, or even peer-to-peer mentoring is very powerful, right? So if we have facilitative mentoring, I think that makes a huge difference and is a very powerful way to move the needle on the dial, rather than directive mentoring and instructive mentoring. I do think mentoring helps, but it has to be mentoring done right.
Right. Okay. And do you think that there's a shortage of, or like there's a shortage of mentorship, the idea of mentorship, or even of mentors in this country?
There's a shortage of good mentors everywhere in every country, because nobody is really taught how to mentor. As part of your leadership development, I mean, you go to an MBA program, you could go to Harvard or MIT here, to Sloan, or to any of the big schools in the US. And I'm not saying the US has the best business schools, but even graduates from there in the United States have not received any kind of training in how to mentor others. They're not taught how to do that. They're taught how to make decisions that will help their companies, grow the bottom line, but not necessarily how to see that people are part of that bottom line and how to raise those people. So yes, there's a huge lack of good mentors. And in fact, that's part of the work that I've been doing in the science community in the Global South, is giving these skills of mentorship to scientists so that they can foster better scientists and better science leaders in their own communities. And we're really proud to say that this program that was launched about 7 years ago, now the program is run by the people who have gone through the program. So the program has created the mentors, and now it's on its own. It's independent. It can spread and grow, and so we are trying to create good mentors wherever we go, because it's such a critical need. That's how you scale, and that's how you plant the seed and propagate the message elsewhere.
So my follow-up was going to be, what do you feel are the short-term and the long-term solutions for this? But it seems that that's the long-term solution.
Yes.
Instilling that into students anywhere, even at the workplace. But then what do you feel is the short-term solution?
Short-term solution is to start the conversation, to start to pay attention to these things, to cultural aspects of organizations, and to start to celebrate when things are going right. So very often we are very quick to point out when something is not right, but we are not so quick to point out when something has been done right. But imagine the value of highlighting something that's been done right, whether it was done deliberately or accidentally. The minute we start to pay attention to what worked, it draws people's attention to, oh, here is an example of what they're looking for. And here is the kind of reward or pat on the back I will get if I do more of it. So the minute we start to pay attention to something that's good, we're going to see more of it. I mean, that's the theory out of appreciative inquiry, right? That in positive psychology, you see more of what you pay attention to. So pay attention to examples of things you want to see more of in an organization, and you will, without question, start to see more of them. So just starting to have that conversation, starting to say, hey, did you see the way Asad gave feedback to, his colleague? That was such a great way to give feedback, because he started with what was good about what his colleague did, what the potentials might be in there. And then when he raised the concerns around the way that he worked, they were all framed as questions, rather than statements that you failed in these ways. They were questions like, how might you improve this? Or how might you do that? And wasn't that great? And that's the kind of culture we want to have in our organization. Once you celebrate that, the person who's listening, absolutely, the next time they're giving feedback, they're keeping that in mind, because that they want to be the person that other people are talking about as having given great feedback, right? So that's a great short-term way to start to plant the seeds for change in culture.
Yeah. That's so interesting. Yeah. And I heard this in the podcast as well. It's about, which kind of falls in line with what you said as well. It's about how you give feedback. And if you start off by giving your feedback by even just saying a simple sentence, and it was actually a magical sentence is what they called it. And that sentence starts off with something along the lines of, what I'm about to tell you is not to be taken to heart, but is to be recognized, because I see potential in you and I know what you are capable of doing. And this is my feedback. And I started doing it at the workplace, and I started seeing everyone picking that up. And now it's a flywheel. It keeps moving forward, and it works. Yeah.
Now that's a virus we want to spread, right?
Yes.
So how might we make culture, a good cultural practice, spread like COVID? That's the question we should be asking ourselves, really. But when you said that, it reminded me of something which I'm now forgetting. But anyway, it'll come back to me if it was important. Oh, yes, I forget. I just remembered. Another thing about feedback, and this is completely a segue, is this is a practice I did deliberately for a year. And it made such a huge difference to my own personal development and my professional development that I try and share this with everybody I know. And that is this, that when somebody says to me, you did a great job, instead of saying, oh, you're too kind, or no, the team was great, I didn't do it alone, I got lucky, none of those things. You ask them the question, could you help me understand what made you say that? Because here is what happens then. They will then give you the specifics of what it was that you said or did or made them feel, or that you thought about, which perhaps no one else had thought about, that gives you the specifics of the behavior that you want to replicate for yourself, so that then your success is no longer a matter of luck or context. It's something that's in your control. you can do more of that because now you know what made people say you did a good job. So asking for that feedback. So don't wait for other people to give you that feedback. Ask them for the feedback. And when you're praising somebody else, always be very specific in your praise and give them the detail of why you're saying that they did a good job. Here is what you said, and this is why it worked. And that's why I'm saying that you did a good job, right? Or here is what you did, and this is how the impact that it had. And this is why I say that you did a good job. That is the greatest gift you can give in terms of feedback. The specificity, the details make all the difference. So just a little bit about
I picked that up in our last conversation. I don't know if you remember this, but even Nagin had gone on a phone call with you. We met for the first time, and that was exactly how you started off the conversation. By being very specific and encouraging, and you praised Nagin as well. Of course, we met for the first time, but and you emphasized this point also, and that has stuck with me, by the way. So
I'm really happy to hear that, Asad. Good. So I'm still practicing what I preach. I'm just validating that.
Great. So I have one question, which is actually more in context to COVID and 2020. What do you feel has been the impact of working from home? And do you think that this is something that's here to stay for the long run?
I think that the flexibility of being able to work from home, I hope is going to be here for the long run. Because there are many situations and many individuals for whom working from home is actually a much better way to find work-life balance and to be the best version of themselves in all of the different personas that they inhabit in their lives. So to be the best parent that they can be, to be the best sales manager that they can be, to be the best spouse that they can be, or the best daughter that they can be, or son as it needs be, right? So I think that flexibility is here to stay. And I really hope it's here to stay. I hope companies are going to recognize that for some people to be able to do their best work, that flexibility is important to them. Because imagine, I mean, just thinking about being someone who might be living in New York City, right? Normally, at least 2 hours of your day are lost to a commute. Now, imagine getting those 2 hours back and being able to start your day without having to go through the stress of navigating the underground or navigating traffic or stressing about, the hold up on the bridge or the cost. I mean, there's a related cost to that. You could, when we encourage remote work, then people can live and work wherever they feel happiest. So there's a reduced cost, one, in terms of the financial cost of living in a city, but also the cost to your well-being and health. I think what we're going to see is reduced health costs as a result of people not having the stress of having to go into work if it's not working for them. But there are people who definitely need that option of being with other people, and that's fine too. And you can create flexible opportunities so that there are certain days when you're working together in person, and there are days or opportunities when you can work apart. It's interesting, when in October 2019, I made a decision that traveling all over the world for work was really not good for my health anymore. And also because my parents are aging and they live in Dubai, and I was constantly flying between the US and Dubai to take care of them. And it was taking a huge toll on me, and also meant that I was not necessarily available to my family members who needed me. So I remember sitting in a hospital while my dad was in the hospital and sending an email to every single client and every single colleague saying that as of now, I'm not going to be doing any more in-person work if it involves travel, because I just can't do it anymore. And everybody's reaction was, my client's reaction, my colleagues were fine. My client's reaction was, but what about this workshop? And what about that workshop? And I said, I'll figure out ways to do it. No, you can't. You have to we have to still do it in person. I said, I'll honor every commitment I've made right now, but after that, I'm not. You need to find other ways to do this or find other people to do this with. And I started to build my capability for doing things virtually. Now, what I found is in the last year, I have been busier than I've ever been before. I've had more work than I've ever had before because I was prepared to go virtual. I had embraced that idea before it became a necessity, right? So I was way ahead of the curve. I was already comfortable with things like Mural. I was already comfortable with Zoom. I was comfortable with a lot of different options that people were learning for the first time. And because I'd already started building online courses, none of my client projects had to come to a screeching halt because I had already started building the alternatives. And in many cases, clients realized that now by going virtually, we could actually increase the number of people we had because the cost of bringing people together was so exorbitant. And now it was just like, okay, let's hop on Zoom and do this. And you can create very fun workshops even through Zoom, right? So we were having people building things and building prototypes and creating portraits and all kinds of things through Zoom, which later they come back and said, that was a lot of fun. We didn't expect that to happen. So yeah, I think that in the future, I'm hoping we will still have a lot of virtual stuff. I am going back to doing some in-person things, but it's more face-to-face. And I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did, most definitely. Most definitely. Okay. The crux is flexibility is key.
Yes, flexibility.
Yeah. Great. So I'm not going to take up too much of your time, Ismet. I think we're going overboard. But I have one last question for you. And that is, in your opinion, is obsessing integral to success?
That's a loaded question because some might say that I'm pretty obsessive about, not about success in the way, it depends on how you define success, I guess, might be my question back to you. But I think commitment is important to success. Whether that's to the level of being obsessive, I wouldn't necessarily say that's healthy. But commitment and a real commitment, something that you hold yourself accountable to. So one of the things that I have done in the last few years is I've kind of built this framework around what it means to be a creative individual. And the framework is a series of nested qualities, right? So at the core, to be creative, you need to be curious, you need to be open, you need to be inventive. And then the affective piece, the heart set piece, is that you need to be playful, you need to be mindful, and you need to be hopeful. So you need to be someone who believes that something better is possible. And then the last layer is where the rubber meets the road, right? So that's the layer that actually creates impact, that creates transformation. And that requires you to be courageous. It requires you to be driven. That's the piece you're speaking about. And it also requires you to be deliberate. So between those two, driven and deliberate, I think that if in order to accomplish success, you have to have a process to get yourself there. You have to have something in place that holds you accountable, where you're constantly, saying, okay, am I making progress towards where I'm going? What am I going to do about it? What are the tactics? How am I going to get it done? Whom do I hold myself accountable to? How do I measure? How do I know when to pursue or when to pivot? Right. So what are my criteria for measuring progress or for making decisions? All of those things are required. And someone who's obsessive might be thinking about all of those things to the point where that's all they're focusing on. But obsessive sounds like a polarity out of whack to me. So I would say committed and driven is definitely something that is being driven and deliberate, and perhaps being courageous too, then is what really helps to create that success. So.
Great. All right, I'll take it.
you.